Hello, everyone, and welcome to Behind the Metronome. This is our first episode of the podcast. My name is Megan Brooks.
My name is Mason Lafferty.
My name is Katie Ashoff.
My name is Mingyang Song.
Why don't we go around real quick and tell everyone about ourselves a little bit? I'm 22. I'm currently majoring in music education and music composition over at West Texas A&M University, and I play the trumpet.
My name is Megan Brooks. I am 22. I am also majoring in music education and composition, and I play bassoon, but also my secondary is the horn.
I'm Katie Ashoff. I'm 24. I'm starting my master's degree in saxophone performance, which means that I play the saxophone primarily, but my secondary is clarinet.
So we just wanted to talk a little bit before jumping in why we're doing this podcast.
We've all heard classical music in all sorts of media. In television, movies, anything that you're watching, you hear music go on in the background, and it's classical music, sounds like classical music, and we'd like to kind of explore what the differences in classical music.
So while everybody has heard of these pieces that we call classical, not all of them are technically categorized as classical music when you look at when they happened in music history. So we're here to sort of take you through a timeline of the musical eras through the symphony. And so we'll take you through composers that you have heard of before, some Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, and some of the big names, but we'll sort of give you some more context. So we'll give you a little bit more context behind these composers and their musical styles.
So this is our first episode, and the title, as you may have noticed, is called Too Hot to Handle. Hi everyone, this is Megan and Mason taking over the beginning portion of our first episode. It's going to be pretty great. We just wanted to give a preface for all of you guys listening. As copyright is so fun, we have decided to link everything down below. You'll see in our interview with Dr. Krause here, he mentions so many different excerpts that everyone should totally check out. And I encourage you all to do so. And to make that easier for you all, you'll see in the description we have every single, excerpt that he mentioned. It's going to be pretty great. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact us via email, phone number, all of that stuff.
So in today's episode, we'll be interviewing Dr. Krause. He'll introduce himself, but he is absolutely amazing. And what we're looking to do in this episode is we'll be talking about the kind of representative composers of the classical era, the ones that everyone kind of knows about. And you'll hear this as Dr. Krause talks about them, but we're going to examine the differences in their styles, and they all lived in different portions of the classical era. And so Haydn kind of helps kick it off, Mozart joins us and really is prominent throughout the middle portion, and Beethoven even is sometimes considered a transitional composer into our next era. And so we're going to spend a lot of time in this first episode looking at the differences and similarities between their practices, because one thing to keep in mind as we shift through eras, it's not just everyone gets up and boom, we're writing in a different style of music. It's a gradual change. And so we're going to look at what practices are remaining, what practices are changing.
Exactly. So to kick it off, like Mason here said, Haydn is kind of our boom. Here's classical. It's, the era where rules are still followed in terms of counterpoint in some senses. And Haydn was born in Austria, so that's pretty cool. He was born in 1732, and he died in 1809.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Already, that's like living through the Revolutionary War.
I
to
know,
put it
right?
in terms, that's going on.
I wonder if he knew, what that was.
I do wonder what they were thinking, because we kind of just talk about the music that they wrote.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think that was he writing his later symphonies while America was over there fighting for?
I wonder if he even had a care in the world about it.
I don't know.
Probably not. When I die, I'll go ask him. But yeah, he's his nickname. One of them is the father of the symphony.
Okay. Yeah, Papa Haydn. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Which makes a lot of sense. He's got. If you look at any of his music, it's very structurally sound and very consistent, which I also appreciate about Bach, which will I don't know that we'll go much into today, but I definitely recommend you check out any of his fugues. So hopefully that gives you a fundamental just basis analysis for Haydn, and we are going to move on to Mozart right now. He was also born in Austria. He was born 1756 and lived to 1791, so kind of short-lived successor, which is kind of unfortunate. I'm assuming this has got to be the one where he worked with Haydn.
I think Mozart worked with Haydn.
Yes. Okay. So he's got some awesome, just music. He's one of my favorites. Anytime I play something by Mozart, it's just really well written. He has. I'm a little bit biased, but his bassoon concerto. Awesome. It's one of my favorite pieces. It's so pretty.
Ooh.
No.
Bias commentary. No, I'm kidding.
Wow. I mean, that would be something I would expect a trumpet player to say, but
look, Mozart has really beautiful music.
Yeah.
Whenever his play and imitation from section to section is absolutely great. His use of woodwind colors is absolutely awesome.
Yeah.
But I have to slander his trumpet parts aren't that interesting. It's a bunch of the capability of the trumpet players back then / the instrument capabilities are a little different, and so we have a lot of just so-dos and da-da-da-da-dos. That's our part, and we kind of wait for most of it. But really, I recommend listening to his music, because I don't listen to music for just the trumpet. I listen to music because I like music. And he uses some really intricate colors, using woodwinds and strings alone. It's great.
All right, so as we said before, kind of Haydn was the Kickstarter for all of this. Mozart is also just as influential, and there is just not enough time in one episode to cover all of Mozart's different just qualities and what he has done.
I highly recommend checking out, if anything, some of his operas.
Mm-hmm.
Really cool things in there. Really, just go check those out. They're so fun and exciting. They're so great.
Oh yeah. Because Magic Flute is very good. I mean, it's a funny story. We did it with WT's opera this last year, and it was it was pretty fun. The bassoon part was a bassoon part, which is pretty interesting, because nowadays, in my experience, people just don't know how to write for bassoon. It's always really way too low or unnecessarily difficult.
I think I'm guilty of writing a little too low for bassoon parts.
No, it's okay. It's just, I don't know. Mozart's one of the best, I would say.
So I like that we brought up the Magic Flute, because the fun thing about that one is Mozart's actually doing a really fun thing with the plot and what character is good and evil. I believe Dr. Krause mentions this already, but it's worth an extra note that up to this point in time, most operas you'll see the bad guy is going to be the people presenting conflict in these scenarios is always this low bass or baritone singer, and the hero is always the high singing, either tenor or soprano. But in this one, he flips the roles, and so you get to see that the good guys are actually these bass voices, and the Queen of the Night is kind of this sinister character that sings not low.
Yeah, we'll be sure to link the what we're referencing, but oh my goodness, it's pretty interesting, and that's totally a thing now too. Especially what comes to mind is Sweeney Todd. Sweeney Todd. He is a low singer. He's got the really low type melodies and whatnot. And then the damsel in distress, his daughter, unbeknownst to him, she sings the really, really high, delicate things about her being locked. She's a bird in a cage, and so it's so interesting that even back then Mozart was wanting to just kind of flip those roles a little bit.
And the last main composer we'll be talking about with Dr. Krause is Beethoven. Also, very well-known composer. This episode we're kind of just getting into the big names. We'll explore some of the lesser-known people throughout, but to kind of contrast these major representatives of the classical era, we have Beethoven, who's actually linking us into the next era.
Oh, yeah.
And everyone knows the fun fact about Beethoven is that he's a composer that struggled with hearing loss and going into deafness. And we'll talk a little about the, how do you say this? Heiligenstadt. Haydn.
The Heiligenstadt Testament. And it's pretty sad. It's kind of his last, kind of describing how terrible.
He's confessing about his, loss of hearing, and if I'm not mistaken, I read this a long time ago, I believe there's some dark tones in there. We'll just say he's not quite happy with life, and we don't know if the letter was meant to be found, but it was not disposed of before he was dead, and so we ended up finding this document, which was a letter to his family that was never sent. But yeah, he wrote about how depressed he was with this, with this difficulty that was rising up. And the interesting thing is, that's still before his Ninth Symphony. He still has one more really impressive and well-known work to write. And now he's at nearly full total hearing loss.
Yeah, for sure. We'll now go into our interview with Dr. Krause. He has some really good stuff to say, and thanks for listening to this first section.
Who are you? Where are you from? What have you done? What do you do? All that fun stuff.
My name is Robert Krause. I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Age of 7, moved to South Florida, Hollywood. And I went to the University of Miami for my bachelor's, my master's, and later my doctorate. Why did I go back for my doctorate there? Because my oboe teacher, I wanted to study more with him. He was fantastic. But also it was a good school of music at that point. Anyway, then I started teaching. I have not taught in anything but universities. My first teaching job was at Eastern New Mexico University 1 year. Wonderful. I'd never been to New Mexico, but it was, I'll tell you what, a very wonderful first job experience. I learned a lot, and they even liked me there. Wow. And then I went to Louisiana, in Natchitoches, Louisiana, and taught there for 5 years at Northwestern State University of Louisiana. I was a double reed teacher there, and I taught music literature, music theory, and I was the upper level theory plus the graduate theory teacher. 5 years, then this job came open, and I applied for this, and I've been here this is my 49th year here. And I've also taught at the Interlochen Arts Camp. It was a national music camp when I started. I taught there for 42 years. I've been an oboe instructor in there. I stopped teaching there when COVID came and we didn't meet, and I haven't gone back. I've had some health problems, so I thought staying closer to home is easier. But you don't need to know that. Okay, fine.
If you had to choose one piece for any of our listeners to go listen to, one from Haydn, one from Mozart, and one from Beethoven, what would you recommend they take a peek at?
I have too many, I'm sorry. Haydn.
We'll take a handful.
I'll tell you what, if you've not heard the Farewell Symphony, I think it's worth listening to. Some of his music is delightful. I like the Farewell Symphony because of the message that he was trying to send. And I thought he did a very nice job. I like the fourth movement. I think it's nice. I like the fact that I got to leave early. Anyway, Mozart, it would have to be an opera. I'm very partial to too many. I'll tell you what. I like Die Zauberflöte because it's a Singspiel, and because he was very clever. In opera, the high-voiced people are always the good people, and the low-voiced are always the bad people. Well, in Die Zauberflöte, the Queen of the Night, the coloratura soprano that hits the high F, she's the bad person. And the good person is the rostro. He's the bass. And I think that's very clever, and he's sort of thumbing his nose at a lot of things. That was, if you've not seen, Amadeus, you definitely need to see Amadeus. It's well worth it, and there's wonderful music. And there's wonderful music in Mozart, Die Zauberflöte, the magic flute. But I think there's lots of good stuff anyway. Some people have asked me, who's your favorite composer? I said, the one I'm listening to or talking about, probably. Beethoven? Oh, there's so many. But I'll tell you, his masterpieces are his Ninth Symphony and his Missa Solemnis. And he wrote those when he was totally deaf. I mean, when he, at the end of the choral symphony, he was still conducting, and they stopped. It was over, and the alto soloist was standing there, and she turned him around to see. They were applauding, and I mean, poor thing, he didn't. But the whole thing is, when you asked me to name something, the first thing that came to my mind was the Florestan's Aria in Fidelio, the beginning of the second act. And Beethoven was a person who believed in friendship, supporting each other. I mean, the Schiller Ode to Joy, the words in there are going to be brotherhood. But what happens in Fidelio, it's a rescue opera, and Beethoven did usually the young lady's being rescued. Well, in this opera, the young lady, Leonora, dressed up as a man, as Fidelio, to rescue her husband who was in the dungeon for a number of years. And her first job, or Fidelio's first job, was to dig the grave for Florestan, because they were going to put him to death because the governor was coming to look at the jails and the prisons, and he wasn't supposed to be there. So they had to get rid of him. They were going to kill him. Well, in Florestan's Aria, begins with lovely woodwinds and stuff like that played, but when the oboe comes in, he's talking about how much pain he's had in the darkness and all that. But when the oboe comes in, the whole tenor of the aria changes. It's like, what's happening? Something's weird. And the oboe's playing the thing, and the oboe goes all the way up to a high F at the end of his at that part of it. But what he is singing about, Ein Engel Leonorin, the angel Leonora, that's his wife. He sees that vision, but he's losing his grip on life here. And Ein Engel I mean, the light comes up in the video that I have, that I show the class this anyway, and they're just, and then it's over. And he goes back to the darkness. But this is John Vickers. He's a Canadian tenor, the late John Vickers. His rendition of this aria, to me, I played it in my class the other day. I stood there and cried. I'm going to cry now, because he touches me. The music touches me. Beethoven's music really does touch me. Especially when he's using voice, because he's speaking. And the Missa Solemnis, which they performed in Amarillo, I was jealous because I've never performed that, but I sat there in tears. It was beautiful. And I'm hearing music and saying, how can you do that? I can't even begin to do that, and I can hear, it's really hard to do, but but there's so many other things. I mean, in those three composers that I give you a list and you say, okay, well, we could do this. Music Lit's only one semester. It used to be two, and it kills my soul. Because I have so many pieces I want them to hear and be acquainted with, because it's so exciting or so touching, and you don't get that.
So, could you tell us a little bit about the keyboard practices of Haydn, Mozart, and early Beethoven?
Well, this is going to sound strange, but it's classical. I did that as a joke. You didn't laugh. Okay. Megan did. She goes, oh, my God. Okay. Well, we have to talk a little bit about the pre-classical to get there, because we're going to resolve ourselves from the Baroque music, which was so, in the high Baroque, it was so abundantly complex. And they wanted something that they could use on the new keyboard instrument of equal temperament, which was the clavier, which later became the piano, or the pianoforte is what it was first, because even through to Beethoven, it was the pianoforte. But sonatas, they thought, well, let's use this instrument because it plays in any key. We don't have to readjust or retune to just intonation or whatever other kind they wanted to do. I always play out of tune, so I guess I'd have to adjust my piano to do that. I do that very well. But the whole idea is, through the pre-classical period, we had some of Bach's sons who wrote for the clavier, or the harpsichord. Scarlatti wrote for the harpsichord a lot, as a matter of fact. But the keyboard was used in the Baroque era in concertos as the continuo instrument, or one of the continuo instruments, and of course for accompanying a sonata or something. Well, they continued that, but they changed that to the clavier or the pianoforte. And let's use that as the solo instrument now instead of accompanying. And Haydn certainly wrote lots of classical style piano music, which used in it the broken chord progression, which we call the Alberti bass, invented by maybe somebody named Domenico Alberti. I say maybe because other people are going to claim, well, I did that all the time before he did it. But he's the one that gets basically the commission for it, because they used his name, his last name. And the broken chord made it very lighter sounding, especially in Haydn. And he's written so many concertos also, but piano solos, the sonatas, which a lot of younger people tend to use because they're within the realm of being played probably correctly, which is nice. And it's nice to have, don't have to play all Clementi sonatinas and stuff like that. Not that they're bad, because they aren't, they're wonderful, but let's use another composer. Going into Mozart expanded on those things. He used, it just kills me to have to say this, he composed everything up here and then wrote it down. I mean, he would just wrote down, that was it. He didn't have to think, okay, what should I do for the next subject or something like that. Like Beethoven did, he developed everything, and Haydn did also. But now the piano, I keep wanting to say concertos because that's what I was thought of before. The piano sonatas that Mozart wrote are very famous, some of them, and the Turkish March. Everybody knows that. The third movement of 331, I think it is, of K331, the crucial 331, excuse me. We have to pronounce what that K stands for. And a lot of the other ones that he did, and Beethoven too. Beethoven's early piano sonatas were supposed to be copies of anything Mozart and Haydn did, but he put his stamp on it. The Opus 2 number 1 piano sonata, in the 32 piano sonatas book, it's 30, not 32. I played that, or wanted to play it, when I became a graduate student. That was the only piano private lessons that I ever had, was with the teacher that I had that I knew. She was terrific. She was a brilliant pianist. She was from Cuba. She had her doctorate from there, which at the University of Miami, they wouldn't let her teach first because she was from someplace else. So she worked in the music library, and that's how I found out that she was a pianist. And then when they did make her a piano teacher, it was wonderful. But I wanted to play that piece, and she says, I said, I already have the first movement half memorized. She said, play it for me. So I did. She goes, it's slow, but you've got the notes and you play musically all the time. She says, but your biggest problem is lack of technique. But Beethoven wrote a lot of things that were, when you first hear it, you go, well, it sounds like it could be Haydn or Mozart, but then something strange happened. And that was Beethoven said, it's me. He wanted everyone to know that, we all, no matter who you are, when you compose, you do it in your personality. Right, Mason? Yes. And that's what Beethoven did. And Beethoven was somebody that was very interesting, we'll call it that. Even, I mean, he had lessons with Haydn, whom he didn't last very long because he thought, this is boring. I'm going to do something differently. But, I mean, he did write in the classical style. And you'll find that in his first 3 piano concertos, too. Mozart piano concertos and Haydn piano concertos. Haydn, I think only in my career of performing in an orchestra as principal oboe, which is probably 40 years, I don't think I ever played a Haydn concerto accompaniment. Yes, I have. Oh, I see it right now. I can't remember the number of it, but this was, as a matter of fact, this when I was in college. I played professionally. They got a small orchestra together so that young people who played concertos would get to have an orchestra to play with, and Haydn would have been one of them. Not that all of his were that easy, or that one was easy. But, I mean, I can remember accompanying Mozart concertos, which I thought were just wonderful, and Beethoven. The first Beethoven I ever heard was the first piano concerto I ever played. And I was second oboe to my teacher in this one. Was my first year in college. At the University of Miami, I had an orchestral scholarship at the University of Miami Symphony. Was the Miami Symphony, so I never got to play first, which was fun because I learned a lot from my teacher. But it was the third piano concerto of Beethoven. Nikita Magaloff was the performer, and I sat there and my mouth just went, I couldn't believe it. Was so, what a wonderful experience. I remember to this day because he played so well, and there were a lot of nice oboe parts in it. In the first and third movements. Do you want to know why there weren't any in the second movement? There was no oboe part in the second movement. You sat there and slept or whatever. I sat there looking around listening. I thought that was the neatest thing. I got to pay attention rather than count my rest. I could just smile. But anyway, the first 3 piano concertos are what we would call his classical period. Beethoven's classical, I call him transitional then, and then he is pre or early romantic in his works. But I think some of his later works were a lot further along than some of the early romantics, believe me. But back to piano music concertos, I think we talked about the Sonata Allegro form, the first movement form. And explaining this to students, usually, especially in piano concertos, there was sort of a formula which Mozart used. There could be an introduction, yes, but there was another introduction which was the orchestra playing the first theme. Then the soloist comes in and goes through the first theme again. So when you hear, usually in the classical period, if you hear the piano at the very beginning, that's very strange because in the double exposition, the orchestra plays first, and then the pianist will play it, and then the second theme, so on and so forth. The use of the orchestra first is to sort of just settle down, everybody. This is it. Now you know what. Now then the soloist comes in. At the end of that first movement, the Sonata Allegro form, we talked about the tonic 6/4 chord. You'll hear that. It'll stop. And you go, what's going on? This doesn't resolve. And then the cadenza comes on. They play, and then they're going to probably end with a trill or a couple of trills that brings you back into the dominant 7th chord, which then goes to the tonic, and that's the end of the Mozart concerto of the first movement, the Sonata Allegro form. They call it first movement form because that's what it was used. If you were going to count up how many times it was used in the first movement compared to the second, probably not the third at all, and the fourth movement, why bother to count? We know it's the first movement that they use it in, but they do use it in other movements also.
say this because we had interesting things we talked about last time, so I'll give you the same precursor. Recently, we went and listened to Beethoven Symphony Number 7, and whenever we were listening to it, there's very clear indication that he does this imitation thing where it's passing, from the basses to cellos to violas to basses, cellos, violas, violins, violin 1 and 2, whatever, however that's split. But you can hear the same idea being passed around, and it's very clearly like a technique that he was really into using. Are there any practices that Haydn and Mozart also had within their symphonic works, or are there any similarities in general between their symphonic works across the board from Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven?
Symphony Number 7, I didn't say this before, but I'll say it now. The first movement is the dance movement, because it's in 6/8. The flute and the oboe have that melody first, of course. Yeah. It's the oboe. But that's very not typical for a symphony movement. And it's Beethoven. I'm going to do what I want. I'll see if you faint or something like that. I'm sure he wasn't thinking that. But the whole idea is he did it to catch your attention. Beethoven always wants to catch your attention. He'll do something. I mean, we think Haydn did it in the Surprise Symphony. Well, of course, that was very nice. But Beethoven just period does it when he does these things. But the Seventh Symphony, I love that. The first, I love all the movements. I mean, when I first played in that one, that was I was still in college and my teacher was still playing. But when the violins came in, they did that fourth movement. And I go, you can play that fast? Wow! I didn't realize how fast they could play and make it sound wonderful in a professional orchestra. Well, how old was I? 19. At that point, I remember, because that was the second year we played Beethoven Number 7. It starts off with a lovely oboe solo at the beginning, half notes. But, okay, so we're trying to talk about passing around the themes, which Beethoven certainly did in that second movement. It's sort of like a theme and variations, and he had more than one theme, but he would add them on top of each other and repeat. He changed the timbre of the melody by passing it through the different instruments, coming from the low, coming to the high, adding the woodwinds. It's really spectacular, I think. Now, did the other composers do this? Mozart liked using the woodwinds. And as it went on, you'll find that one of his favorite instruments was the clarinet. And he used the clarinet quite frequently. In Haydn, the first time he used the clarinet in a symphony was number 99 out of his 106 plus. Of course, we only say he wrote 104, but it doesn't matter. But see, the oboe was an instrument that right from the beginning, because it carried over from the Baroque. Well, the clarinet wasn't built in the Baroque era. The chalumeau instrument might have been, but that was when it was too soft in the orchestra. It got drowned out. The oboe could piercely, I mean, if you played on a quacko reed, you could certainly be heard, which we try not to do. We want to blend in. My whole thing as an oboist is to blend with other people so that it becomes a flow bow if it's a flute and an oboe. And it's the mesh of those two. And we produce a third color then. We got flute, got open, we've got the flow bow. And Beethoven liked that. And so you're going to find that in Mozart also in his symphonies. Theme and variations, all of them liked it very much. And that's what's happening basically in their use of it. But passing around a theme, different timbre of the different instruments, and maybe some different articulations, talk to Beethoven about that one. And Mozart did it somewhat. Mozart, you need to understand, well, you don't need to understand anything I say, but you need to understand that Mozart was busy writing operas as well as his symphonies. And his symphonies were very light and happy most of the time. Some of them aren't, but you're going, this was fun. I really like this. You get to Beethoven with the symphonies. They were fun too. They're quite wonderful. But see, he only wrote one opera. And Mozart wrote operas in Italian and Singspiel in German. Haydn wrote a lot of operas too. And of course, Haydn was composing for Esterhazy and whomever else were his patrons. Getting paid, that was how he lived. La Ci darem la mano, which was from Don Giovanni. It's a duet of the Don and Zerlina, where he's trying to seduce her. And Beethoven liked that, but the instrumentation that he wrote it for, 2 oboes and an English horn, that is the original orchestration. I would say instrumentation. But he also wrote an Opus 81, Opus 87, I lied. Opus 87, trio for 2 oboes and an English horn. He thought that was, we think it's terrific too. But the La Ci darem la mano, it's a wonderful set of variations. He was very, very clever. Not that he's the only one. I mean, look at the Mozart Twinkle variations. But Beethoven, he wrote a lot of Diabelli variations for piano. The Eroica variations are for piano, but that was his favorite theme. Da 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 dum, da dee da dum, ba dum bum bum, bum ba da da dee da da dee da. You find that in the 4th movement of the Eroica Symphony. Of course, the oboe plays that melody first. But see, he started off that. I said this last time. The Eroica theme comes in only in the 4th movement. There's a slow, well, kind of a bombastic introduction. Then what comes after that, instead of the theme, comes the accompaniment. And then he has a variation on that accompaniment, and the second variation on the accompaniment, and then he brings in the theme with the oboe and the rest of the orchestra playing too loud, so the oboe gets drowned out. Excuse me. My English is pathetic today.
So we've solidified that they all liked some form of motivic player imitation.
Beethoven especially, because Beethoven, he didn't necessarily always write theme and variations, but if you saw his sketchbook, and I've seen them in libraries or museums, he takes a short theme, and then he goes through that and changes it, and if he's like me, he goes back and uses the first one. You had to find out that you didn't like anything else you wrote. But I mean, he did that. That's why his themes were always short. Just like the Eroica Symphony in the 1st movement. Da da dee da 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 dee da dum. That's E flat major, except the last note's a D flat. And that's what that whole movement's about.
That's been stuck in my head for so long, and I had no idea what piece that was. So thank you so much, and I'm gonna go find that after this.
And his introduction to the 3rd Symphony is really very different, because the introductions to Symphony number 1 and number 2, if there was a slow introduction, and Haydn did this and Mozart did this, not all the time, but most of the time, what he changed was to start the Eroica Symphony 1st movement, 2 E flat major chords, and that was it. Bum, bum, and then the strings come in. Ba-da-dee. And I thought, clever. And, you know, Beethoven's 1st symphony, when he begins the slow introduction, he did something no one else had ever done. He starts with the dominant 7th chord and then resolves it. And then another dominant 7th chord that resolves it, so on, until he finally gets to what he wants to do. And then comes the Sonata Allegro form after the slow intro. I mean, the introduction was to set the mood, I guess. But see, the 1st movement is usually fast. I'll say for all of them is fast, but he starts with a slow intro in his 1st symphony and in his 2nd symphony. Not the 3rd symphony. The 4th symphony, yes. How does he start the 5th symphony? It's cyclic. Ya-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum. And then you use da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But he uses 3 shorts and a long in all the movements. That's how come that's called cyclic. He uses them differently, but they're there if you look hard enough. He was a genius for taking a little bit of something and making a big, wonderful thing. Mozart, what he did, and his father took him out because he wanted to show off his kid, you know, my kid's a genius, you know, because I'm a genius too. But the whole idea is you play a theme or tell, Dad would say, anybody have a tune you want my son to make a piece on right in front of you? So they'd whistle a tune or they'd play it for him and he'd go and write. He'd improvise a whole piece. You just want to slap the brat. You know, I mean, it's just totally... I do believe, and this is just coming from me, that Mozart got his gifts from God to be the musician that he was, and to be able to write everything in his head and then just write it down. He just wrote. Okay, here it is. Oh. Beethoven suffered through everything that he wrote, he suffered through. He lived through it because he wanted to change things, make sure they were just perfect. Were they perfect? None of us are. But a lot of people thought that Beethoven was. I mean, they called it, who was it? They called him the Titan. Well, I think that might have been Tchaikovsky. But they're referring back to Beethoven as, well, look at Brahms. Brahms' first symphony he wrote when he was in his 40s. He'd written lots of stuff before. Do you know why he wrote it until he was 40? He didn't think he could write a symphony after Beethoven. So lots of people said, yeah, you wrote his 10th symphony. Your first symphony was his 10th. Because Brahms was a romantic at heart, but he wrote as a classical composer. I mean, he wasn't during the classical period, but he liked always to everything he used a classical size orchestra, just as Beethoven did. And that was his whole thing, is to be very absolute music. We called his music absolute music because he didn't like program music. Beethoven did write one program symphony, though, and it was really weird because he used 5 movements in it, which wasn't heard of at that time. It came later, all the other romantic composers that did it, but the Pastoral Symphony. And in his second movement, he liked the sounds of the birds. So he had the flute as the nightingale, the oboe as the quail, but the cuckoo had to be the clarinet. I always like telling the clarinet players, I look just right at him. Okay, the Farewell Symphony. Well, I'll talk about... I think Haydn, first of all, Haydn had a wonderful sense of humor. And writing the Farewell Symphony, I think, was humorous, but it also was something he was caring about his musicians. They were paid by the royalty that they worked for, and when the royalty went to their summer houses, the orchestra or other musicians had to go with them, and they would leave their families at home. And they were homesick, and they wanted to go home, so Haydn wrote Symphony number 45, the Farewell Symphony, into the last movement of his Farewell Symphony. It starts off fast, like a fourth movement should, and then but it changes the mood and is a little bit slower. And in the music, your part ends, you're supposed to get up and leave. Well, the first time I ever played that, I thought it was weird because I left before the second oboe left. First of all, I would go, well, let him play that. And he did. Played very nicely. And you just get up and leave. Well, a lot of people think, what's going on? I always like playing that because you can hear the audience think, what's going on? Why are they leaving? Are they sick? Do they do what? Yeah, I'm going, yep, really. I had to go get some water. Well, in this video that I showed in my music literature class, you've got some of the guys pulling out a bottle of champagne because they're walking out, or wine, they're going to go drink it because they're done with their part. And the video that I play for the class, the conductor is Daniel Barenboim, who's a very famous pianist. And he's acting like, what's going on here? No, sit down, and all this stuff until the very end. It's really very comical. And they did get to go home the week later or something, I don't remember, but they let the servants, go home. Probably that's because they were going home anyway. But the whole idea is, I think the Toy Symphony, his father, imitated those sorts of things. And Haydn, the Surprise Symphony, everybody fell asleep in the Surprise Symphony. Oh, not really. Not after that first melody. And he crashes the cymbals. Everybody. I love playing that piece too because I'm looking out at the orchestra. I'm out to the audience, and they go, boo! They go like this. I laugh. I think it's funny. So thank you, Mr. Haydn. But he also, in his London symphonies, and that starts with the 90s going to 104, the instruments that he used in there. 99, he used the clarinet. So there you go. There's something unique. And you have the Military Symphony. What does it use? Guns, and they kill. No, drums. the drum roll symphony. It's called. I call it the military symphony. And there are ones that use trumpet and the clock symphony. He's imitating the clock, bup, 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 in the slow movement, just as Beethoven did in his Eighth Symphony. But he wasn't imitating the clock. He was imitating Maezel's metronome. Maezel is the last name of the one who invented the metronome, and he was good friends. He and Beethoven were friendly, and Beethoven was thumbing his nose at him. He thought, "Oh, this will be funny. I'm going to imitate your metronome because I think it's stupid." Oh, I don't know if that's really what he thought, but I thought that was a good way to look at it. But the second movement of the Eighth Symphony has the woodwinds play bup, 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 bup. I always thought it was kind of stupid, but it was fun. Other instrumental pieces, you'll find serenades written by Mozart, and he usually is two oboes, two clarinets, two bassoons, and two horns. No strings. Now he has written the one that's it's called a divertimento. I think he uses the cello or the double bass, but he liked using the wind instruments. Mozart did the serenades. Haydn, Sinfonia Concertante. I've played it. It has an oboe. It has a cello. It's been so long ago. My gosh, it's 40 some years ago. I don't remember it. I played it here, as a matter of fact, with the orchestra. But Mozart, Sinfonia Concertante. Is it 247 or 246? I think it is K246. It's for 4 solo instruments: the oboe, the clarinet, the bassoon, and the horn. And it's one of my favorite pieces to play. The final movement is a theme and variations. Of course, the theme starts off with the most beautiful wind instrument, the oboe. That's what it is. When played well, the voice is the most beautiful instrument. God's creation. All those other instruments were created by some idiot human being, I guess, or something. But I thought you told me you were going to pay me to do that. Megan's going to say, "Yeah, I'll give you some Monopoly money."
Hello, everyone. This is the Q&A portion of our podcast, and we have a couple awesome questions asked for us by our viewers. So our first question today, someone was asking about the defining characteristics of the classical era. I think this is an awesome question because we are covering the classical era today. Yeah. And so just for the classical era, it can be pretty overwhelming, especially only having limited knowledge of music in general. Mason, do you want to take it away with some just basic characteristics that the classical era contains?
I would absolutely love to. So kind of how this episode's honestly titled, Too Hot to Handle. Some, I can't say most or all, but some musicologists, historians, consider Handel a Baroque composer, and so the episode being called Too Hot to Handle is kind of reflective on this little change we see with music, because a lot of Baroque music gets quite intricate with embellishments. You hear little trills, you hear little ornamentations just all over the place, and if you go listen to some of those like Bach fugues, there's really intricate counterpoint and just crossing lines everywhere. And classical music in general kind of backs away from that a little bit, especially in the beginning and the middle of the classical era. And we start seeing this emergence and prominence of something we call galant style. All it means is that it's just very hummable. It's very melodious. It's a lot simpler. There's less overall moving lines. And so that's kind of one of the biggest changes I see between the previous era, Baroque, and classical, There's that change from things are getting increasingly more complex, and we start relaxing a little bit. We start seeing just more melodious melodies, and to prove that, listen to any of Mozart's symphonies. You will not walk away without a melody stuck in your head. It's impossible. They will just latch onto you. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it really, I think, as I personally have been more exposed to music, the two main, I guess, eras to get comfortable with are classical versus romantic. And in our next episode, we'll cover more of some of those characteristics. But yeah, it's the classical to me sounds more of what you would expect a non-musician to call classical music, honestly. If you were to play something by Handel, Mozart, Haydn, all of that, it's very, to me, light in ways that you will see in the Romantic era is more dark and heavy. And so, yeah, I would say 20th century, which we'll cover in our third episode, is very unique and, to me, very easily identifiable. But yeah, I hope that answers your question, listener. But yeah, let's get on to the next question. Our next question is about just classical composers in general. We heard in today's episode, Dr. Krause mention a lot of different composers. And the question is referring to the most popular ones. Bach, Mozart, Handel. Those are the big three, I would say.
yeah, definitely a lot of people will, I mean, we kind of recognize those names from elementary school even. They'll just mention them as like, yeah, look, these are the composers. I mean, there's some other ones that are also well known and prominent, but that's like Christoph Gluck. I will butcher his first name always, but Muzio Clementi, Muzio.
Yeah.
I don't know. Y'all should find a podcast where they say his name right.
Yeah. Muzio. But yeah, any of those composers are just pretty standard staples of the classical era. So, listener, I hope that answered your question. So, another question we had from one of our wonderful viewers is just how to get exposed to these different types of composers with playing, especially. This person in particular is a clarinetist. Yes, super fun.
B-flat instrument friend for me.
Yes, super fun. But yeah, it's tough because a lot of orchestra and band directors will kind of stick to the same rep in terms of just the same types of music. I would say I wasn't exposed to, I would say, a vast variety of composers until college. It's always good to get out there, though. Try out for all the region things, all state things if you are able to. It's just good experience in general. And yeah, I would also recommend if you've got a local orchestra, it will not hurt you, and you'll probably get to play some pretty great music, I would say.
I certainly hope they don't hurt you in your hometown orchestras. Yeah, for sure. I know I've had some pretty good. I've been exposed to quite a bit of overall classical music. As far as actual just classical era music, it's a little smaller for me. I played trumpet, and so we're not super prominent. This is around the time that trumpet actually starts becoming a little more used. It's not until the Romantic era that we'll see prominent use of brass instruments and further techniques, but there's like the Brandenburg concertos, and one of those, I want to guess it's number 2. If that's wrong, comment down below and call me out. But there's a piccolo trumpet, which is really cool, and so there's some, even even Haydn and Hummel have trumpet concertos for E-flat, trumpet, or cornet, and those are really great. But as far as me being exposed to that music, take part in all region, all area competitions, so you can join those bands, orchestras, choirs, so you can maybe be exposed to this music. A lot of those conductors of those groups like to play something old, something new, something blue.
Something
not quite
borrowed,
there.
something blue.
Something, yeah.
All right, so hopefully you enjoyed that Q&A segment of our classical era behind the Metronome episode. We just wanted to thank you guys for listening. And if you feel free to leave a comment, leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it. And be sure to check us out next time for our Romantic Era episode, which is entitled
Mahler? I hardly know her.
Ah!
That's a real laugh.
Like a laugh. Alright, thanks you guys.